Carpenters for Christ that will be here in June and also in July to do some work, so keep them in prayers. Also, we've got to sign up the Vacation Bible School. The sign-up sheet is complete. It's complete, I think.
Registration.
We just need somebody for registration, and that usually kind of works out itself. So, thank you guys for signing up for Vacation Bible School. We didn't have to beg, steal, or borrow for that. So, thank you guys for doing that. Also, there's a sign-up. When you yelled at me, I looked at my wife. So, that's a good one. Oh, that was funny. The sign-up sheet in the back for the food handout for the DeKalb County Child Nutrition Program. It's going to be at the elementary school, and we need around 20 people to help do that. It's going to be from 3:30 until 6:30, and I forget the exact date, but it's in June 18th. So we'll just meet. You can either meet down there, or we can meet up here and drive the van, or we can walk. It's just right down there. So one of the two. So we'll get you some more information about that. Is there anybody else as far as also Alan's mom, continue to keep her also in your prayer. She's waiting on some test results and trying to figure out where they're going to go from here. Anybody else? Okay.
My friend Marcia Pell, she had a colostomy reversed today.
Okay.
And the surgeon thought they were going to have to do an ileostomy first and then finish it in the second surgery 3 months later, but it got done in one surgery.
Awesome.
And for her, as she recovers from
Recovery. Absolutely. Anybody else? Anybody else?
Remember Tate on Tetherwood?
Yes, remember that family. This is the same family that's also from Geraldine. They're related, right? Okay. Anybody else? No, we're not going to have singing tonight. It's going to be. I'm not going to go to 7 o'clock, I promise. But we just got a lot. I don't know why everybody started laughing. We got some things I want to go over as far with our parables. So let's do that. Go to Matthew chapter 24. Matthew chapter 24. And the reason we're going to start in Matthew chapter 24, and I know it is not a parable. All right? It is not a parable. But the next parable that you have is going to be found in Matthew chapter 25. Now, I know that we have went over this a couple of years ago with Revelations, but we did not go over it in great detail because we stuck mostly with the book of Revelations. So in Matthew chapter 24, it is going to start in Matthew chapter 24, starting in verses 2, and it is going to run all the way through Matthew chapter to the end of Matthew chapter 25, and it is going to tie in together, and I want you to keep that in mind. All right, now, before we start this, if you'll look, I'll do it for you, in Mark chapter 13, and also Luke chapter 21. Those are a condensed version of what you find in Matthew chapter 24 and also Matthew chapter 25. Those are more condensed. But in the book of Mark chapter 13 verses 3, which is the same story, just a condensed version. In Mark chapter, and I want to try to take my time through this because there is a lot of information that I want to give you. In Mark chapter 13, verses 3, it says, as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, it's the same story that you'll find in Matthew, This is just a few hours, literally, before you get to the Passover and to his trial before Pilate and then his crucifixion. So this is at the end of his earthly ministry. And it says, and as he sat upon the Mount of Olives over against the temple. Now this temple he's talking about is the temple of Herod. You remember I think you've got 3 temples that you have in the Old and New Testament, but then you have a coming temple, which is the millennial temple that you will have when you start studying the book of Revelations. And some people say there is going to be another temple that is going to be built during the tribulation period. So either how you look at that, you're going to have 4 or 5 temples that are going to be found in Jerusalem. And this temple that they're actually talking about was a temple that was started construction in 20 AD. And when they are looking at this temple, when he is there during the Passover, it's going to be about 30 AD. The construction of that temple actually ended in around 63 AD. And then in 70 AD is when you have Titus, the Roman general, that is going to come in to Jerusalem and completely destroy that city and completely destroy the temple. So that is your timetable that you're looking at. So this temple, although it is not completed, it's still many years before the construction is completed, it is still the largest structure in that area or in that known world. And this is what he says, and he says, as he sat upon the temple, these are the people that he tells this to. And that is why it's extremely important that when you start studying the sayings of Jesus Christ and the life of Jesus Christ, in a lot of the Matthew, Mark, and especially Luke, those stories, the majority of them will tie in together. Matthew will insert certain areas that Mark and Luke will leave out, and vice versa. When you get to the book of John, he does not have a lot of what Matthew, Mark, and Luke will record. His is completely different, what he records. So when you're looking at this, if you was just to pick up Matthew chapter 24, and you start reading it, and it tells us in verses 1 of Matthew chapter 24, and I promise I'll tie all this together. It says, and he's with his disciples, and they said unto him, okay, when you start getting to Matthew chapter 24, verses 3, and it says, and he sat upon the Mount of Olives, and the disciples came unto him privately. If you read that, you're going to assume that it was the 12 disciples that asked him this question, correct? But if you get to the book of Mark, he gives you more of a pinpoint as who's actually asking this question. Not all of the 12 disciples are going to hear this answer. It is only going to be 4 disciples that hears this. Because it tells us in the book of Mark chapter 13 verses 3 that it was Peter, James, John, and Andrew who asked these questions, not the rest of the disciples. And you remember when you start studying the life of Christ, you start studying disciples, he had his kind of an inner circle. And it was Peter, James, and John, and sometimes Andrew. So mostly you're going to be dealing with Peter, James, and John, but in this instance, it's going to be a 4th disciple that's going to be added. Now, he tells these disciples this privately, these 4 disciples, but more than likely, the remainder of the disciples, which is Matthew and Simon and those others, they are going to hear about this from Peter, James, John, and Andrew. So they're going to be informed upon what Jesus Christ is talking about in Matthew 24 and also Matthew 25. But those 4 are going to get it directly from Jesus Christ. All right? Now, going back to Matthew chapter 24. The reason you study Matthew chapter 24 before you get into Matthew chapter 25 is where the parables actually start. Matthew chapter 25 is when you have the parables, and we'll go over this hopefully tonight. You have the parable of the 10 virgins, okay? And then you have the parable of the man that leaves his servants in charge of some money. And then you have the parable of the talents. So there's a couple of parables that you find in Matthew chapter 25. And the reason you cannot just skip over Matthew chapter 24 and start studying the parables in Matthew chapter 25, because it's not going to make any sense of what Matthew chapter 25 is talking about, because you're dealing with the second coming of Jesus Christ in Matthew chapter 24 and also Matthew chapter 25. And for those of you guys that sat in with us on our Revelation studies, we went over this, but it's been a couple of years. I know some people may not, that are sitting here tonight, may not was in this study. So before we get into the parable of the 10 virgins, I want to quickly go back over Matthew chapter 24, because every bit of it is going to tie in together. Okay? So again, Matthew 24 and 25, and then you got Luke chapter 13, and then Mark chapter 13, and then Luke chapter 21. If you want to write those down, you can go back later and reread all of that. So when you start looking at Matthew chapter 24, it is going to parallel the book of Revelations chapter 6. All right? So in Matthew chapter 24, starting in verses 4, and I'm giving you all this sort of for you guys an outline. In Matthew chapter 24, starting in verses 4 through 14, that is going to parallel with Revelations chapter 6. And in Revelations chapter 6, and I will go there, and I have kind of got back into reading or rereading all of like Revelations and the Matthew and stuff like that. In Revelations chapter 6 is when you start looking at what we call the four horsemen, okay? And what Revelations chapter 6 is essentially a Reader's Digest version of the book of Revelations. So if you read Revelations chapter 6 and you did not have any of the rest of the book of Revelations, you could pretty well make sense of what's going to be happening during the tribulation. So Revelations chapter 6 and also Matthew chapter 24 are going to run parallel with each other. So in Matthew chapter 24, and I'll give you an outline for this. In Matthew chapter 24, he is going to be speaking about the rise of false messiahs. And that's going to be found, we'll go back and look at this. It's going to be found in Matthew chapter 24, verses 4 and 5. And then that is going to run parallel with the rise of the Antichrist that you find in Revelations chapter 6, verses 1 and 2. So Matthew chapter 24, verses 4 and 5 runs parallel with Revelations chapter 6, verses 1 and 2. And then he's going to speak on, and we'll go back and look at this, he's going to speak on in Matthew chapter 24, verses 6 and the first part of verses 7. Because 7 is actually, you look at it as Matthew chapter 24, verse 7a, and then Matthew chapter 24, verse 7b, because that verse is going to carry 2, all right? So you're going to hear of wars and rumors of war in Matthew chapter 24, verses 6, and then the first part of 7. And then when you get to Revelations, it's going to run parallel again with Revelations chapter 6, verses 3 and 4. So those are the exact same. And the reason that you look, and it's Peter, James, and John he is telling this to, who is the only disciple that is going to write a book that is going to deal with end times in great detail? It's John. So what John is doing is remembering what was taught to him in 40 years prior or 50 years prior to this. So that's why he writes that Revelations. That's where he gets his information from. Not only from inspiration of the Holy Spirit on the Isle of Patmos, but also remembering back what Jesus Christ said upon the Mount of Olives. So then when you get to Matthew chapter 24, verses 7b, the second part of verses 7, in verses 8, it's going to be famines and earthquake he's talking about. And that's going to run with Revelations chapter 6, verses 5 and 6. And then the last thing he is going to mention in Matthew chapter 24, before he gets into the last part of the tribulation, is going to be actually in Matthew chapter 24, verses 9 through 14. Okay, Matthew 24, 9 through 14. And that's going to run, and that is the persecution and the martyrs. Okay? And that's going to run parallel with Revelations chapter 6, verses 9 through 11. So maybe we all got that. All right, now, if you look in the book of Luke chapter 19, verse 11, and I'm trying to set all this up for you so it'll make more sense. The disciples at that time believed, and we've all have been taught this, the disciples believed that what Jesus Christ was going to do was come and set up his earthly kingdom immediately after his death, burial, and resurrection. They, in their mind, all they have known is captivity. And we've talked about this. They've only been known in the very first part of the Old Testament as being a free people. And then you remember they were taken into Babylonian captivity, Assyrian captivity, first of all, Egyptian captivity, Assyrian captivity, Babylonian captivity, captivity under Greece, and then captivity under Rome. So that's all they've been taught, and that's all they've known. So what they are thinking is Jesus Christ is going to come, set up this earthly kingdom, and this, what he is discussing in chapter 24, they believe it is going to be within their lifetime. That's what they're believing. Because it tells us in the book of Luke chapter 19, verse 11, that they believe that it's going to be, his kingdom is going to be established immediately during their lifetime. Little did they know it's 2,200, 2,300 years later, and we still don't know when the second coming is. All right, so we're still waiting. So that is really what they're going to believe. Now, and we've already went over, and there's really, and I know that we gave four distinctions that he is going to be talking about in Matthew 24, 4 through 14. But there's also an additional. Okay, so we're dealing with we're dealing with false prophets, we're dealing with famine, we're dealing with martyrs, but there's going to be an increase of evil, but also during this time, during the tribulation, there's going to be an outflowing of the gospel. And there is going to be a gospel that is going to be preached and preached and preached and preached and preached by those 144,000 Jews that are sealed, and they're going to go out and give the gospel. And we looked at that in the book of Revelation. So you're looking at that. So, and I want to kind of set this up. So in Matthew chapter 24, verses 1, this is right before Jesus Christ is fixing to be crucified. And he has told them time and time again, this is what's going to happen. I'm going to be handed over. The Gentiles I'm going to be handed over to Gentiles. I'm going to be crucified. I'm going to die. I'm going to be buried, and I'm going to rise again. They really did not understand that completely until you get to the book of Acts, when you have Pentecost. And there's people that will look at Matthew chapter 24 and also Matthew chapter 25, depending on their views on end times. And they will say that Matthew chapter 24 actually took place, what Jesus Christ is talking about, takes place in 70 AD when Titus comes and destroys Jerusalem. But there is something wrong about that, because it tells us in Matthew chapter 24, verses 29, that the sun is going to be darkened, the moon's not going to give light, the stars are going to fall from heaven, and the powers of heavens are going to be shaken. I don't believe that's ever happened, not to my knowledge. So there's no way that he is talking about this is going to be happening in 70 AD. All right? So Jesus Christ in the book of Matthew, also in the book of Mark, and also in the book of Luke, he is going to be dealing with the second coming. Not the rapture, but the second coming. And you can look at this, some people look at this and go, oh, he's talking about the rapture. This is what he's talking about. He's talking about when he comes and raptures the church. And I've mentioned this numerous times, and I'll say it again, that the church to Peter, James, John, and Andrew is foreign. They have no idea what he would be even talking about. because the church did not come into existence until you get to the book of Acts and Pentecost. And it really did not come into the existence as far as a Gentile church until you get the salvation of Cornelius. That is when the Gentile church really comes into existence. So if he was to be, he is talking to 4 that we know of, 4 dedicated, educated, die-in-the-wool Hebrews. He's talking to Jews, not talking to Gentiles. So if he was to start saying, oh, listen, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to rapture the church. She's my bride. I'm going to take her to heaven. And then after 7 years, they're going to look at him and go, we don't even know what you're talking about. Okay, what is this thing you're talking about, the church? What is this thing about Gentiles? We don't even like Gentiles. We don't want nothing to do with Gentiles. And you can see that on when you get into the book of Acts. So they are asking him a question that does not concern the church. They are asking him 3 questions that is going to concern who? Them. And who are the thems? The them is the nation of Israel. And I want to kind of point this out also. In the last year, probably 9 months, there has grown a hatred of the nation of Israel like I've never seen. And we are raising a generation of people that are misinformed about Israel. And they're getting their information and they're getting their news from the TikToks and the Instagrams and the Snapchats and things like that. And they will give this idea that the Israel that Jesus Christ is talking about in the New Testament and also in the book of Revelations is not the same Israel that you find in the Old Testament. Okay, I didn't know there was 2. I just thought there was 1. So there is a hatred for that country. There is a hatred for that people. And we're raising a generation that they are believing that. They want to blame everything on the Jews. They want to blame everything on Israel. Now, are all Jews law-abiding, God-fearing? No. Not all Americans aren't. So, but we are told in the book of Genesis, we're told all throughout the Old Testament, and we're even going to look at this when you get into Matthew chapter 25, and it starts in verses 32, that we are to pray and to stand with the nation of Israel. That is what we are to do. They are God's chosen people. America is not. When God tells Abraham in the book of Genesis, here's what I want you to do. Wherever you walk, that is going to belong to you. And what is amazing about that is Abraham never got to inherit the promised land. He just got to mark out the boundaries. It's later when you get into the book of Joshua where they finally get to inherit the promised land. But we are raising a group of people or a generation, and all you hear now is free Palestine, free Palestine, free Palestine. And we're living in that generation. And Jesus Christ tells us that before the rapture, before the second coming, there is going to be a disdain and a hatred for that country like never before. And you're actually seeing that now. But they will always go back to where it's not the same Israel that he's talking about. That the church has replaced Israel. No, it's not. There is 2 schools of thinking now. There is a school of thinking that I hold to that Israel and the church are separate. They are not the same. All right? Israel and the church are not the same. But then there is a school of thinking that the church has replaced Israel, and the reason the church has replaced Israel is because the Jews was the ones that crucified Christ, and by them crucifying Christ, they gave up that inheritance or gave up that promise that was handed down to Abraham 2,000 years or 3,000 years before. The church and the nation of Israel are different. They're not the same. So please keep that in mind, all right? And if all you have to do is just start looking online about Israel and the church, and you will come up with all types of crazy ideas. But if you study the scriptures, and if you study the Old Testament, and if you study the New Testament, God is dealing, especially in Matthew chapter 24 and 25, with the nation of Israel. And we have studied this and we've talked about this, that the book of Revelations, and the reason you have the Great Tribulation is not for the church, because the church is not here. The church is gone. The people that are left here, he is going to be focused in on his people, bringing the nation of Israel back to him. That is what the tribulation is all about. So now, with that 30-minute introduction. And Jesus went out and he departed from the temple. And the disciples came to him, and the disciples came to him and to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus Christ said unto him, see ye not all these things? All right? And I say unto you, now there is one time that Jesus Christ is going to predict the future, and it's going to happen in their lifetime. One time and one time only. And that you're going to find it in verses 2 of Matthew chapter 24. Because in order for a prophet to be taken with credibility, what they say has to come true. Like if somebody was to tell us now, in 1,000 years, such and such and such and such is going to happen. Well, how are we going to believe them? We're not going to be here in 1,000 years. But if somebody comes down and says, this is going to happen within the next 5 to 10 years, and they're going to exactly pinpoint what is going to happen, then we're going to believe what they say, correct? So in order for a prophet, in order for Jesus Christ, for those people to believe what he is going to say, something has got to come to fruition in their lifetime. And this is going to happen in 70 AD. It's going to happen in their lifetime when this happens, all right? So look with me in verses 2. And then he tells us, he says, there shall not be left here one stone upon another, that thou shalt not be thrown down. What he is talking about is when Titus, the Roman general, comes over in 70 AD and he destroys the temple. It's in all the history books. And in order for these disciples to finally believe this, because I'm going to tell you, they actually did not believe much of what Jesus Christ said until they're standing there and you get to the book of Acts and he's talking to them and he ascends up into heaven and they're standing there with their mouth open like, and the angel says, what are you standing here for? Why you mean gazing? The same Jesus is taken up is going to come back down. So then they finally start to, okay, understand what is happening. We're going to understand what is happening. So he tells them, look back in verses 2, that not one stone is going to be left upon another. Now, in dealing with this, all right, in Matthew chapter 24, you are dealing with the tribulation. And he's talking about these things are going to happen before my second coming. Not the rapture, the tribulation. And you look at the tribulation, and I'll give you this really quick. The tribulation is the 7 years in between the rapture of the church and then the second coming of Jesus Christ. And what you have is you have a tribulation and then you have a great tribulation. They both happen in those 7 years, but one of those is just called a tribulation, but the second part of it is called the Great Tribulation, also called Jacob's trouble. And you'll find this out in Matthew chapter 24, verses 29, because we'll kind of go over this quickly. He gives the details of what's going to be happening in the first 3.5 years. Okay, we're not going to be here. We're going to be up in heaven. But he tells us, starting in verses 29, immediately after the tribulation, all right? After what? After the tribulation. But then he tells us in verses 21, for then there shall be what? Great tribulation. So you start looking in verses 5, running all the way through 19 or 20, that's tribulation. But when you get to verses 21, it kicks into high gear, and then it's a great tribulation. That is the last 3.5 years. But then he tells us in verses 29 immediately after the tribulation, those full 7 years, these events are going to start taking place. All right? So now, so you have that. So, and as he sat, this is verses 3, and as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, and the disciples come to him privately, and this is what they're going to ask him. They're going to ask him 3 questions. And some Bible commentaries will say it's just 2 questions, but, it depends on how you split them up. This is what they're going to ask, and they ask him privately, Peter, James, John, and Andrew. This is what they're going to ask. And he says, tell us when these things shall be, and what shall be the sign of thy coming and thy the end of the world? Okay, what things? What he has been discussing with them for probably 3 years. And notice that they ask 2 questions really into 1 question, all right? And here's the question. He says, what shall be the sign of thy coming? Again, the rapture and the second coming are different events. With the rapture, and we'll look at that here after, probably next week. With the rapture, you have us going to him, correct? It's called a catching away. The word rapture is not mentioned nowhere in the Scripture, but the word catching away is alluded to. So what the rapture is Jesus Christ calling his bride, the church, home to get it away from tribulation. So that is what the rapture is, to pull up. All right? Now, they do not say, when is the sign of us going to you? They say, when is the sign of what? You coming back to us. Because they're living in a time that they have already lived through the first coming of Jesus Christ. And that takes place when he is born of a virgin. All right? Now they are talking about, when are you going to come back a second time? Because he has discussed with these disciples, I'm coming back, I'm coming back. They're wanting to know when. When are you coming back? All right? And notice this. And the end of the world. Not the church, not the rapture, but we want to know when you're coming back and when is the end of the world coming back. That is what is on their mind right before the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. So what Jesus Christ does is he goes through, starting in verses 4, and he says, okay, if you want to know when the second coming is, when I'm coming back for you guys, you start watching for all of these signs to take place. Now, granted, some of these signs we have experienced, not these specific signs, but types of these. If you look, it says in verses 5, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. That's been happening since the birth of Christ, all throughout history. So that is nothing new. But there is a specific time he is talking about. And then he talks about, you're going to hear of wars and rumors of wars. And we've heard that's been happening since the days of the book of Genesis. But what he is going to say is that this is going to increase and increase and increase. So what he is dealing with right now is he is dealing with the second coming. They're wanting to know, all right, what should we be looking for when you come back? What do we need to be preparing for that we are prepared as a people when you come back to get us and to get us out of here? And Jesus Christ is saying, okay, here's what you're going to have to start looking for. There's going to be false prophets. There's going to be false Christs. There's going to be wars and rumors of wars. Nations going to rise against nation, kingdoms, famines, pestilence, earthquakes. And he starts naming all of this stuff off. And then he gets to verses 15. All right? Now let's look back in verses 14, talking about the spread of the gospel. So really what you have in Matthew chapter 24, and just from verses 5 through 15, is really you have those verses, and he's telling you what the tribulation is going to be like. But if you want to study more in depth, you go to the book of Revelation. So he's really giving them a condensed version of what they're wanting to know. In verses 14, he says, and this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached into all the world for a witness unto all nations. And then, what's going to happen? The end's going to come. So their second question, or their third question, however you want to look at that, their last question is, what is the sign of the end of the world? There's no more. Because you got to have a new heaven and a new earth. He says, if you want to know when all of it is finally over with, and you can take a sigh of relief, and you're going to live with me, and it's forever and forever, the last thing you're going to have to look at is this. He said there's going to be a preaching of the gospel in all the nations, and when that happens, then the world's going to come. Okay, now, then he tells us in verses 15. Look in verses 15. And if you start looking in verses 15, you can go back to the book of Daniel, and it can correlate with this. If you look in Daniel chapter 9, verses 27, you can write this down. Also in, I think it's 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 4. And then in Revelations chapter 13, verses 14 and 15. You're dealing with the Antichrist. All right? Now, he is going to call him, you have the Antichrist and you have the false prophet. And then you have then you have the devil or Satan. He's called the dragon in the book of Revelations. But the two other characters besides Satan is going to be the Antichrist and the false prophet. And what the false prophet is he's basically the PR man for the Antichrist, is really what he is. But when he starts looking at verses 15, in verses 15, it says, when ye therefore see the abomination of desolation, this is when you start getting into the great tribulation. This is the kickoff of the last 3.5 years. That is spoken by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place. All right? You'll find that in Daniel chapter 9, verses 27. A little bit more in detail about that. And what he is discussing is the event that he is talking about in verses 15 is not going to be found in your scriptures. But what he is talking about, it happens in between the Old and New Testament, and y'all heard me talk about this. Between the Old and New Testaments, you have two books, the book of Maccabees 1 and the book of Maccabees 2. And that is essentially the 430 or 470 years that happens to the nation of Israel in that time. So if you want to know the history of Alexander the Great, the rise of Greece, the fall of Greece, and the rise of Rome, you study the Maccabees, and you'll get more information on that. But what is happening in verses 15, you'll find out more about that in the Maccabees. But what he is talking about is not going to happen during their lifetime, not during the book of Daniel's lifetime. It had already happened before the disciples were even born. As that is when you have a man by the name of Antiochus that actually is the Greek king. He is a Greek king, and he is going to, and Greece takes over the nation of Israel. And what he does is he comes in and he desecrates the temple. He does away with all the sacrifices. He slaughters thousands and thousands and thousands of Jews during his reign. I think it's only like just a few years. And he offers up sacrifices upon the altar of unclean animals. And you can read all about this. But what he is talking about in verses 15 is there is going to come a person that is going to do the exact same or be like what is happening, what he is talking about in the book of Daniel. He is the Antichrist. And you can learn more about that in the book of Revelations. So in the book of Matthew chapter 24, all the way up through verses 15, you've got a condensed version of the tribulation. And they are wanting to know, okay, when are you coming back? When are you going to hurry up and come back? And he is giving them all this information. And I'm going to have to quit. We'll get through this, I promise. All of this is going to lead up to the first parable that you have in Matthew chapter 25. And it says, the kingdom of heaven is like. And we've looked at this several times when he starts talking about the kingdom of heaven. He's talking about i.e. salvation and i.e. heaven. So we'll get through this. I wanted to kind of give you all of that. So when you start looking at Matthew chapter 25 and those two parables that we're going to look at, and this might finish up our parables, they'll make a lot more sense. All right? Is there anything else before we dismiss? Well, I talk longer tonight than I preach.
Yeah, Molly had wanted us to let everybody know that Senior Sunday is this
Okay.
St. Doggo's our only senior, and there'll be a basket back there.
Okay.
For the gifts.
Senior Sunday is this Sunday. Anybody else? All right, Chris, would you dismiss us, please?
Lord, I thank you for this day, Lord, and thank you for Brother Chris and the message that he's brought today, Lord, and the preaching and teaching that he's given us, Lord. Thank you for his family, Lord, and pray that you'll be with us this week and bring us all back safe. So all these things I ask in your name. Amen.